This week in news surrounding Israel, God is a Zionist. The question is, are you? So stay tuned, friends, for all the details. Well, shalom, everyone. Welcome once again to this week's newscast. I'm Robert Gottslig, your host. And this week, I want to tell the world that the God of this universe is a Zionist. And therefore, the question I have for you is simply, are you? Because if you're not, you are heading on a collision course with God, and you'll have to give an account one day of what you did or didn't do to the least of these, Jesus' brothers and sisters, the Jewish people. And so very simply, if God is a Zionist, we ought to be. Now, maybe you're wondering, what is Zionism? Well, very simply, it means that you identify that the Jewish people have a right to return to their ancestral homeland. And Douglas Murray, a British author and conservative political commentator and journalist, and by the way, a solid advocate for Israel and the Jewish people, he laid that out very well in a recent Munk debate in Toronto, in Canada. And we'll provide a link below that you can go to and subscribe to see the entire debate. And I encourage you to do that. But here's just a few highlights of what he said in that debate. That started this terrible war, you'd have thought that there would have been some sympathy from the world. You might have thought the world would pay attention to the attack and at least pay attention to the people behind it. You might have expected, like me, that there might have been a worldwide opposition to the terrorists and rapists and the murderers of Hamas. You might have thought there would have been hatred around the world erupting, that the government of Qatar and its mouthpiece Al Jazeera, its funding of Hamas and its hosting of the leadership of Hamas in Qatar. You might have thought that there'd be an outpouring of rage at the Islamic revolutionary government in Tehran, but no. There was an immediate outpouring of rage against Israel, the state that had been attacked. Douglas went on to say, he says, the interesting thing about anti-Semitism is, as my late friend Jonathan Sachs said, it's a shape-shifting virus. It moves across the centuries. When you could hate people for their religion, the Jews were hated for their religion. Then you couldn't hate people for that anymore, so people hated the Jews for their race. Then after the 20th century, people realized that wasn't such a great idea either. Now the Jews are hated not for their religion or their race, but for having a state. People around the world hate them so much for it that the Israelis are attacked when they have hostages taken. And they're also attacked when they rescue their hostages. The interesting thing about anti-Semitism is the Jews can never win because historically they've been hated for being rich and for being poor. They've been hated for integrating and not integrating. They were hated for being stateless, and now they're hated for having a state. Today, the only really acceptable form of anti-Semitism, aside from the sewers of the far right, the only real tolerated form of anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. And Zionism, as we just heard, is simply the right of the Jews to self-determination in their historic homeland. That's all. He further goes on. Anti-Semitism, as we've also heard, is double standards against Jewish people or cruel and unfair treatment of people because they're Jews. This isn't very far away from home here. If this isn't anti-Semitism, can the audience here tell me why the following things have happened since October 7th? And he goes to talk about what's happened here in Canada. Listen to what he says. He says, why in a Montreal suburb, a synagogue should be firebombed as happened in November. Where there should have been gunshots against a yeshiva. Why in Toronto, a bookstore owned by a Jew should be attacked. Why a Molotov cocktail was thrown through a Jewish community center in Montreal. Why a Toronto Jewish deli in North York was firebombed. Why in Toronto the Orthodox synagogue was vandalized. Why in Toronto 2 men opened fire the other week on a Jewish girls' school. And then he goes on to conclude this. He says, and one question hovers over all of it, above all questions of who would protect the Jews. Would you trust to protect them? Maybe the Europeans would protect them. How about the Arab world? No. History shows only one people protect the Jewish people. It's the Jewish people. That's what Zionism is. Thank you. Wow. Amazing. Well said, Douglas. But as far as God being a Zionist, which in the end is the most important thing to consider, friends, we must look to his word. And there we will find that it is God himself that has chosen Zion, the land of Israel, to put his name there forever. Yes, that's what we read in Psalm 132, verses 13 to 14. Let me read that for you. God says, "For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling place. This is my resting place forever. Here I will sit, for I have desired it." And seeing that God owns the land, friends, as I've said before, he can give it to whomever he wants, and he has to the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as an everlasting possession. And even though God had scattered the Jewish people to the four corners of the earth because of their disobedience to him, his word's very clear that he would also regather them back in the latter days, the days in which we are living in. Because one day, when the kingdom comes, when Israel's Messiah returns, the law will go forth out of Zion to the world. And you're going to see the preeminent shift from the Gentiles into the Jewish people as their Messiah. And Jesus is going to be ruling and reigning on the throne of his father David for 1,000 years. This is what we read on Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 to 4. "Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. Many people shall come and say, 'Come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations and rebuke many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." And so there you have it. God is a Zionist. And he's also jealous for Zion with a great jealousy. Simply read Zechariah chapter 1 and you'll find that out there. God is a Zionist. He's jealous for Zion. He's jealous for his people. He's regathering them back right before our very eyes. And at the end of the day, as I've said before, and as Douglas Murray pointed out, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. You cannot separate the two. And therefore, the question is, friends, what side of history do you want to be on? Do you want to be a Zionist because the God of this universe is a Zionist? And even Douglas Murray, who didn't point to the Bible, can clearly see that the Jewish people have a right of a return to their ancestral homeland. And it is only them that is going to protect themselves. And actually, I'll go one step farther. It's not the Jewish people that are going to protect themselves, but it's the God of this universe that is ultimately going to protect the Jewish people. Because when we look at Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 35 and 6, God says that as long as the sun, moon, and stars are shining in the sky, to paraphrase it, that Israel will not cease from being a nation before him forever. And so what side of history do you want to be on? I trust you want to be on the side of history that lines up with God's passions and God's love. And he has an everlasting love for Israel and the Jewish people. And so, friends, continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. The Jewish people need our prayers more than ever. And if they ever needed a friend, now is the time. And as believers in God's word, we ought to be standing, supporting, and loving Israel and the Jewish people. And we need to be pro-Zionists. We need to be Christian Zionists who come alongside them and support them and love them and stand up for them every chance we get against those that hate them. And remember what Psalm 129 verse 5 says, "Let all those who hate Zion be put to shame and turned back." May it not be said of us. May it be said of us, believers, that we love Zion. We love Israel and the Jewish people. And with that, and until next time, thanks for joining us on another episode of In News Surrounding Israel. God bless.